Tonight's story is called The Christmas Day Kitten, and this was literally written before I was born. Look at that. It's pretty crazy. Christmas can never go by without my remembering a certain little cat. I first saw her when I called to see one of Mrs. Pickering's much-loved basset hounds. I looked in some surprise at the furry little creature moving along the floor. "I didn't know you had a cat," I said to Miss Pickering, who was a plumpish, pleasant-faced woman. Mrs. Pickering smiled. "We haven't really. Debbie is a stray. She comes here for 2 to 3 times a week, and we give her some food. I don't even know where she lives." "Do you ever get the feeling that she wants to stay with you?" I asked. "No," Mrs. Pickering said. "She's a timid little thing, just creeps in, has some food, and slips away. She doesn't seem to want to let me help her in any way." I looked at the little tabby cat again. "But she isn't just having food today. It's a funny thing, but every now and again she pops through into the sitting room and sits by the fire for a few minutes. It's as though she was giving herself a treat." The little cat was sitting very uptight on the thick rug which lay in front of the fireplace in which the coals glowed and flamed. The 3 bassets were already lying there, but they seemed used to Debbie because 2 of them sniffed her in a bored manner and the 3rd merely cocked a sleepy eye to her before falling back asleep. Debbie made no effort to curl up or wash herself or do anything other than gaze quietly ahead. This was obviously a special event in her life, a real treat. Then suddenly she turned and crept from the room without a sound and was gone. "That's just the way it is with Debbie," said Mrs. Pickering, laughing. "She never stays home for 10 minutes or so, then she's off." I often visited the Pickering home and always looked out for the little cat. On one occasion I spotted her nibbling daintily from a saucer on the kitchen floor. As I watched, she turned and almost floated on light footsteps down the hall, then through the sitting room. Debbie settled herself in the middle of a pile of basset hounds, in her usual way, uptight, still, and gazing into the glowing fire. This time I tried to make friends with her, but she leaned away as I stretched out my hand. However, I talked to her softly and managed to stroke her little cheek with one of my fingers. Then it was time for her to go, and once outside, she jumped up on the stone wall and down the other side. The last I saw the little tabby figure, she was flittering away across the grassy field. "I wonder where she goes," I murmured. "That's something we've never been able to find out," said Mrs. Pickering. It was 3 months later that I heard from Mrs. Pickering, and it happened to be Christmas morning. "I'm so sorry to bother you today, of all days," said Mrs. Pickering. "Don't worry at all. Which of the dogs needs attention?" "It's not the dogs, it's Debbie. She's come to the house and there's something very wrong. Oh, please hurry." I drove through the empty market square. The snow was thick on the road and on the roofs of the surrounding houses. The shops were closed, but the pretty colored lights of the Christmas trees twinkled in the windows. Mrs. Pickering's house was beautifully decorated with tinsel and holly and the rich smell of turkey and sage, and onion stuffing wafted from the kitchen. Stuffing, oh. But she had a very worried look on her face as she met me through the sitting room. Debbie was there, but she wasn't sitting upright and wasn't gazing into the fire. She was lying quite still, and huddled close to her lay a tiny kitten. I looked down in amazement. "What have we got here?" "It's the strangest thing," said Mrs. Pickering. "I haven't seen her for several weeks, and then she came in about 2 hours ago, staggered into the kitchen. She was carrying a kitten in her mouth. She brought it in here and laid it on the rug. Almost immediately I could see that she wasn't well. Then she lay down like this, and she hasn't moved since." I knelt on the rug and passed my hand over Debbie's body, which Mrs. Pickering had placed on a piece of sheet. She was very, very thin, and her coat was dirty. I knew that she didn't have long to live. "Is she ill, Mr. Harriet?" asked Mrs. Pickering in a trembling voice. "Yes, I am afraid so, but I don't think she is in any pain." Mrs. Pickering looked at me, and I saw that there were tears in her eyes. Then she knelt down beside Debbie and stroked the cat's head, while the tears fell on her dirty fur. "Oh, the poor little thing! I should have done more for her." I spoke gently. "Nobody could have done more for her than you. Nobody could have been kinder. And see, she has brought her kitten to you, hasn't she?" "Yes, you're right, she has." Mrs. Pickering reached out and lifted up the tiny bedraggled kitten. "Isn't it strange? Debbie knew she was dying, so she brought her kitten to here. And on Christmas Day." I bent down and put my head on Debbie's heart. There was no beat. "I'm afraid she's died." I lifted the feather-light body, wrapped it in a piece of sheet, and took it out to the car. When I came back, Mrs. Pickering was still stroking the kitten. The tears had dried, and she was bright-eyed as she came in. "I've never had a cat before," she said. I smiled. "Well, it looks as though you've got one now." And she certainly had. The kitten grew rapidly into a sleek, handsome, and bouncy tabby cat, and Mrs. Pickering called him Buster. He wasn't timid like his little mother, and he lived like a king. And with the ornate collar he always wore, he kind of looked like one, too. I watched him grow up with delight, but the occasion that I always remember in my mind was the following Christmas Day, a year after his arrival. I was on my way home after visiting a farmer with a sick cow, and I was looking forward to my Christmas dinner. Mrs. Pickering was at her front door when I passed by the house, and I heard her call out, "Merry Christmas, Mr. Harriet! Come in and have a drink to warm you up." I had little time to spare, so I stopped the car and went in. In the house there was the festive cheer of last year, and the same glorious whiff of sage and onion stuffing. Blah. But this year there was no sorrow. There was Buster. He was darting up to each of the basset hounds, ears pricked, eyes twinkling, dabbing a paw at them, and then streaking away. Mrs. Pickering laughed. "Buster does tease them. He gives them no peace." She was right. For a long time the dogs had led a rather sedate life. Gentle walks with their mistress, plenty of good food, and long snoring sessions in front of the fire. But then Buster arrived. He was now dancing up to the youngest dog again, head on one, asking him to play. When he started boxing with both paws, it was too much for the basset, who rolled over with the cat in a wrestling game. "Come to the garden," said Miss Pickering. "I want to show you something." She lifted a hard rubber ball off the sideboard, and we went outside. He threw the ball across the lawn, and Buster bounded after it over the frosty grass, his tabby coat gleaming in the sun. He seized the ball in his mouth and brought it back to the mistress, dropped it at her feet, and waited. Mrs. Pickering threw it again, and Buster brought it back. Yeah, I gasped. "A retriever cat?" The Bassets looked on unimpressed. Nothing would ever make them chase a ball. But Buster did it again and again and again. Mrs. Pickering turned to me. "Have you ever seen anything like it?" "No," I replied. "It's the most remarkable cat." We went back into the house, where she held Buster close to her, laughing as the big cat purred loudly. Looking at him, so healthy and contented, I remember his mother, who had carried her tiny kitten to the only place of comfort and warmth that she had ever known. Mrs. Pickering was thinking the same thing, because she turned to me and, although she was smiling, her eyes were thoughtful. "Debbie would be so pleased." I nodded. Yes, she would. It was just a year ago today that she brought him in, wasn't it? That's right, she hugged Buster again. The best Christmas present I've ever had. The end. I hope you guys go to a rescue shelter and all adopt a cat. Love you.